Hello and welcome. This is a series of messages that I've entitled Home Remedies, and it deals with relationships. Relationships are probably the most important and also the most challenging aspect of our life, and they really affect us in the three most important arenas that we live in every day. The first one, of course, is the marriage relationship. Husbands and wives face particular challenges learning how to love and serve and enjoy basically their time together as husband and wife. And then we have the second arena of life, which is our family life, particularly if we have children. And that is meant to be an extension of the relationship between a man and his wife and a wife and her husband. And then last of all, we have the third arena, which is our life in the marketplace. Paul used the illustration in Ephesians 6 to talk about slaves and the relationship to their masters. And that's really has some carryover, even though we don't have that same dynamic today. It does apply to how we relate to each other in a working relationship. But right now we've been focusing upon primarily the marriage relationship because it's foundational to all relationships and in many ways may be the most challenging. We've talked about the various dynamics that go into learning to live and to love and to serve one another in the marriage bond. And one of the things we left off last week in Ephesians 5 was where Paul said it was key to begin with submitting ourselves one to another out of reverence for Christ. And that's an important point to make at this juncture because as he moves on in the chapter, he tells wives you need to submit to your husbands, and he tells husbands you need to love your wives. Now, I've had many women say to me, well, that seems so unfair that God has put such a heavy burden on wives to submit themselves to husbands. And as I've noted, that is a challenge because it's submitting yourself to someone who is a sinner. But I would tell you, and I would argue, that the husband's responsibility is even far more challenging. And I think it's the reason why we find that so many men fall down in their area of responsibilities as husbands. Because for them to fulfill their calling, they have to love their wife in the same way that Christ loved his church and gave himself for her. It's that sacrificial love of the maximum kind, the ultimate kind, that he says men are to strive towards in their relationship with their spouse. And we all understand why this is challenging because every one of us is kind of selfish. We're not only self-centered, but we tend to be self-preserving. And the idea of sacrificing myself, giving my life up for someone else goes against all of my natural inclinations, or what the Bible calls my sin nature. Many of us don't like to think of sin nature like that. We like to think of sin as something that we occasionally fall into, a mistake, an error, a falling short in some way or another. But it is our natural inclinations. It is what is native to our nature. And that's why it's easier to yield to selfishness, self-centeredness, and to resist anything that would cause me to lose my life in this world, this kind of self-preservation mentality. It's easier to give into that and follow that than it is to follow the path of the cross. Or at least that's how they used to speak of following Christ. Basically, Jesus said that if any man would come after him, he must deny himself, pick up his cross, and follow him. And the deny ourselves is the first place that we usually get hung up. But then when we go to the secondary idea of picking up my cross, there was no mystery in Jesus' listeners as to what picking up your cross actually meant. It meant laying your life down and dying to yourself. In a sense, it's kind of a self-annihilation, if you will. Not without a meaning, but certainly you become the doormat for others to walk across. Or maybe more accurately, that when people are cut off from the other side of the river, you become the bridge that enables them to get across it. And that's really the call that we have as Christians. That our goal is really, or should be, that we seek to help others grow in their relationship and go forward in Christ, and to really try to turn away from and deny those things in ourselves that would be a hindrance to that purpose. And so sometimes when women say, well, I feel like the role of a woman is so much harder than a man, I just come back and say, look at it closely and you begin to realize the man's job is really hard. But then the question arises, so why does Paul begin by speaking to the women? Let's read again exactly what he says here. He says, wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of his wife, as Christ is the head of the church. He himself being Savior of the body. But as the church is subject to Christ, so also the wives ought to be to their husbands in everything. Now, the word everything is a little bit misleading in terms of translation, because when we hear the word thing, we think of all these little things through our life, and we start counting through all of these things and saying, I have to submit to my husband in everything. In other words, do I have to submit to my husband in my thought life? Do I have to submit to my husband that I never say anything that contradicts him? And unfortunately, oftentimes that has been the teaching. But what she's talking about, what Paul's talking about here, isn't a moment by moment, object by object, or situation by situation decision-making process. He's talking about an orientation of your life, that there is a submissiveness of your heart towards your husband because you know it's right in the Lord. But it also reminds me of the movie, science fiction movies I watched when I was a kid. And you'd always have these aliens come down in their spaceship, and they'd waddle out off the planks, and they'd come up to the first humans, and they'd say, take me to your leader. Or when something is going crazy and people say, who's in charge around here? Or we have problems at the store saying, can I talk to a manager? You see, we understand this idea of hierarchical relationship, that ultimately for anything to function effectively, any kind of government or system or even family has to have somebody who is ultimately responsible. It's like they said of President Harry Truman, that he had a plaque on his desk that when people came in, it just simply said, the buck stops here. And in a way he was saying, you can't buy me. But also he was saying, I take ultimately the responsibility for what happens under my watch. And we find that term used a lot by responsible leaders. They say, I need to be careful and take responsibility for what happens under my watch. If you're a husband, the things that happen in your home are the things that are under your watch. Ultimately, you have to follow the breadcrumbs back to yourself. This was a hard thing for me to learn in early years of my ministry, because when things would go wrong and people would drop the ball or make a mistake and get things wrong, I'd automatically try to find out who's the guilty party. But over the years, I learned something was very valuable, that when I began to really pray about why something happened, I always found that the breadcrumbs ultimately led back to me. And that's the failure of leadership oftentimes, is the sense that we don't understand this is why we need to be in prayer. This is why we need to be seeking the will of God, because ultimately, no matter who drops the ball or who's responsible, it always leads back to you. And that's the same thing in the home. That it's hard sometimes to own that, isn't it? That you see your kids struggling or your marriage struggling or whatever else is going on, and you want to be able to say, well, it's a bad kid, a bad seed, or if I had married a different wife or a different husband. And yet the truth of the matter is that we are largely responsible for creating the environment in which our family lives and grows. And we have to take that responsibility. We have to come humbly before God. As I look back over my years as a husband and a father, I think to myself, I wish I had prayed more for my kids and for my wife and the journey that they would take. It's not that we didn't pray, but I really felt like I wish I had prayed more. Maybe that journey would have been easier. Maybe they would have found more victory and had more joy in their life now that they're adults. Well, that's speculation. You can't know for sure. But that's one of the things we have to understand, is that if we're going to lead a home, we have to take responsibility to be the leaders. But also in my book on marriage, one of the things I point out, I have one chapter that says men who will not lead, and the second chapter is women who will not follow. And those are, again, we talk about these reciprocal relationships, these mutual responsibilities and obligations. And I think that we have to start asking ourselves as husbands, am I leading my family in the direction that I want them to go? We often interpret that as providing them with material things, which is certainly a responsibility. Paul said to the Thessalonians, any man who doesn't provide for his own house is worse than an unbeliever. So to fail to provide financially for my family is a dereliction of duty. I'm there to provide for them. I'm there to protect them from harm that might come. I mean, I've had people ask me, is it right for me to defend my family if our home is invaded or they're threatened in some sense? And I say it's not only right, it's your God-given obligation and duty to do that. But also we have a responsibility to love, to nurture, and to train. And we'll talk more about that as we get into it. But none of that is possible if the wife is unwilling to submit herself to her husband's leadership. And I know this isn't a popular concept today. I know that we live in a world which basically says men and women are exactly alike, except in some obvious physical distinctions. In fact, even in this age where we're beginning to have these foolish, silly conversations about gender derivations and gender variety, which is a bunch of pablum nonsense. It's not based upon any kind of scientific fact or reality. We know that there are males and there are females, and it's not just an issue of gender. We know that biologically we're sexually separated and become very different people. And so one of the things that God said is that it is his will for the man to be the head of his family. If you look in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, beginning verse 1, he says it very clearly that God is the head of Christ, Christ is the head of the man is the head of his wife. But that head doesn't mean domination in the sense that we think of it, but rather he is there to be the ultimate helper of her joy. Most of us get it clearly about the idea of a parent-child relationship. I mean, no child expects himself to have more authority and more insight than his parents, unless, of course, he's trained that way by his parents. But the simple fact of the matter is, as a child, we're looking to someone to provide us leadership and how to negotiate and manage life. And we'll never completely outgrow that need. In fact, I would guess that the reason that you're listening to this today is because you recognize that you have that need to be mentored in the way in which you live your life in relationships with other people. Well, given that as a fact of life that we all accept in every other relationship, why do we assume that the marriage relationship is something different? Or that somehow it's a totally equal authority home setting? Now, let me put out a word of caution here. First of all, that anytime a husband has to say, I'm in charge around here, that's his first indication that something's wrong. My belief is that when a husband is leading as he should, any woman would be willing to submit to him and follow him because he's there to care and protect and provide for her. And he understands that. But when a man has to start asserting that he is in charge of his family, then he's probably abdicated that responsibility someplace down the road. And gentlemen, as you hear this, you may be saying, well, I don't think that's the case in my house. Well, I'd almost have, if I had enough nerve, I'd say, why don't you ask your wife what she thinks about that statement? Because I guarantee it that she'll probably say, you know, I could really deal with some more assertive leadership in our relationship. I want to know that you're taking me to a place that's good. And so this is why it becomes such a challenge, because as human beings, people who have a sin nature, again, our natural inclination is to do what? It's to look out for my interests first, to take care of me, to meet my needs, to fulfill my desire. It's a very hard and spiritual thing to live your life thinking about the welfare of someone else, that you put them before yourself. And the Bible never says that you shouldn't meet your own needs, but it says you should look to the needs of others before you look to your own needs. And one of the things I think we find in life, when we start becoming outward focused in ministering to the needs of others, that God overwhelms us with his provision for our needs. The people who are going around saying, my needs aren't being met, are usually the people who have spent all of their energy trying to meet their own needs. And that's really a bottomless pit. You'll never get to a place where you are able to meet every need and to satisfy every desire in your own heart. You're always going to end up feeling like you got shortchanged someplace. But when we commit ourselves to a path of saying, you know, I'm going to live and serve others sacrificially and lay my life down for them, suddenly you find that you're fulfilled. In fact, it's the Apostle Paul who quotes Jesus as saying, more blessed to give than receive. The greater blessing is in the giving than it is in the receiving. And that becomes the basic principle of a thriving marriage relationship. When I stop becoming so self-absorbed about taking care of me, and I start thinking about how can I bless this other person, there's a fulfillment and satisfaction that may or may not come back from that other person. They may not appreciate, they may not recognize it, but there's a sense that God does. Because remember last week I said when we pronounce those marriage vows, a man is vowing to God that he's going to love his wife. And a woman is vowing to God that she's going to respect her husband. Which brings me to that word respect. It's interesting that respect implies the idea that you treat somebody with a honorable deference. And that's really what's caught up in this idea of being in subjection to your husbands, that you hold him in honor and you show deference to his position. And one of the things my father taught me when I was a kid, because I grew up as a military brat, the first years of my life, he's told me, he said, you salute the uniform, you don't salute the man. Because he told me, you're going to find a lot of times where the man in the uniform isn't worthy of honor, but don't dishonor the uniform and the position that he holds, because there are also men in that same place who are honorable and respectful and who are servants of others. And I think that's a principle of life that we've lost today. We have this idea that if we rebel against authority, that somehow that makes us more alive and more free. What it does is it puts us into a no man's land. We are certainly more free in the sense that we are more vulnerable and we stand alone. And so it's important that as a wife that you respect your husband's role and his responsibilities. Now, here's another thing that most women don't get, because oftentimes when women complain about their husbands is, well, he doesn't love me. And it's interesting because that is the issue for the man. The man is more concerned with being respected than being loved. And that's why men mistakenly think, well, if I show my wife respect, then she'll show me respect back. And I'm not saying that we're disrespectful, but women yearn for that loving relationship. They yearn to be adored. They love to be told that they're beautiful. And it's interesting because I don't know of any woman who actually looks in the mirror and says, I'm beautiful. Every woman I've ever known can just pick herself apart in 1,000 ways and tell you all the things that are wrong with her. And it's almost crazy because I just figured if I was living with somebody that perfect, they wouldn't live with me. But I'm living with somebody who is flawed just like I am, who has struggles and issues, who ages and shows the signs of aging just like I do. But we don't love people just because of who they are on the outside. But more importantly, we love the person that they are on the inside. And I know that's terribly cliche, but in the end of the days, it comes down to being the real central issue. That beauty is only skin deep. But ugliness or true beauty can be as deep as you allow it to go. And some people become really ugly on the outside, and when they are, it makes no difference how attractive they are on the outside. But when people are beautiful on the inside, it transforms the outside as well. They have this natural radiance of graciousness and of goodness. And ladies, that's the thing that you should be really seeking God to give you. That, as Peter would later say in his first letter to the church in the 3rd chapter, he said, let the unbelieving husbands be won by the lifestyle and the attitude, the behavior of the wives, who he said, don't make your adorning the outward appearance. He says that make it the inward man of the heart where the Spirit of Christ lives. And so I know this is challenging. I know it's not an easy thing, but it's also not easy on the man's side either. He has to go through those same struggles. One of the best books I've ever read on this whole subject was by a guy named Emerson Eggerichs. It's called Love and Respect. And I would just recommend it to you. If you want to read deeper and look into it, it's certainly available on Amazon, or you can Google it, or I don't know if there are not many Bible bookstores open anymore, but you can certainly find it online and through many book clubs. My wife used thrift books a lot because they're cheaper and you can get used book at half the cost. But anyway, the reality is that good reading like that helps to really fortify a relationship in a meaningful way. And this issue isn't something that you're just going to hear me talk about and then you're going to pick up and carry it forward. I know it's the reality is if you as a husband and wife really dedicate some time, some study time to really focusing on books like that really encourage. I might also encourage my book. I deal with this in a couple of chapters. And so if you're interested in getting that, just let us know. You can contact the church and they can mail you a copy. But the simple fact is we need to understand that these dynamics are not optional. Marriage does not work unless we listen to these concepts. Well, I'm just about out of time, and we've talked a lot about the lady's responsibility and responses to her husband to show him respect. And men are desperate for that, ladies. Your husband is desperate to be treated with respect. But I want to go on and talk more in detail about the man's responsibility in loving his wife. And again, we'll explore further why this is often so much of a challenge. So I want to thank you again for spending your precious and valuable time with me. And I look forward to continuing this conversation next week.